Sure, he may just be repping that drip, but I don't know, at this point I'm suspicious of anything he does. Oh, and his missing teeth switch place, so at least we know he's been to a dentist. Hello my fellow weebs and welcome back to the One Piece saga. The series covering my never-ending journey of watching through One Piece for the very first time, giving my thoughts on it and ranking each arc in a tier list to determine which is unquestionably, definitively, and definitely not just in my opinion, the best one. As per usual, if you have any questions regarding the format, the first video in the series will likely answer it. But today we have an arc that has the calm before the storm written all over it, with both the final pieces of the war being put into motion as well as quite a few totally new reveals. Though let's not get ahead of ourselves and take a quick look at how the tier list is looking right now. The very recently covered Sabaody arc shot straight up to the top S tier and simply left me speechless. So, will the follow-up be just as great? There's only one way to find out, so let us jump straight into Amazon Lily. The very first thing I want to bring up before we even get into the story is a very quick catch-up as to where my thoughts were at this point. After the crew got annihilated in Sabaody, I was truly clueless as to how things may play out in the short term. So going into this one, I had literally no idea what to expect. Clearly there was a war on the horizon and Ace was being held in Impel Down. Yet we still had no inkling of the crew ever switching direction and going to save Ace. So again, I went into this one with my thoughts well and truly all over the place. And with that said, you can imagine my reaction seeing Luffy flying through the sky in a completely random direction all by himself and only apologizing to his crew for not being able to save them. As you'd expect from Luffy, he obviously just blames himself for basically everything that happened, and it plays into much of his story this arc. Both with him calling himself weak, as well as reminiscing about how his friends would always be there to help. And this is an aspect of this arc that I really enjoyed. We're not constantly reminded of how bad he feels, etc, etc. Instead, we see him mostly be his usual optimistic self, but then dropping a line about someone from the crew and that being that reminder that it is constantly on his mind. I feel like this almost implicit approach of showing us that despite his cheery self, he is devastated by what just happened, made these moments just that much more impactful. Though in a broader sense, oh boy, did it feel weird to see Luffy alone. I mean, this is basically something that we haven't seen since all the way back in Romance Dawn. Not once in the, 400 episodes has he been by himself for such a long time. And like I brought up in Sabaody, it almost feels like we were thrown all the way back to square one. I'll be honest, throughout this entire arc, I was expecting for us to somehow regroup or at least hear from the crew. Yet, nothing. We'll talk about the separation specials in a bit, but in the arc itself, we don't even get the smallest clue as to where the rest of the Straw Hats may be. And that just felt, for lack of a better word, uncomfortable. Though soon after landing, Luffy manages to eat a whole bunch of parasitic mushrooms and passes out, ultimately leading to him being saved by the local tribe. And this is where we get a bit of a lore dump about Amazon Lily. Put briefly, this is an island of only women, and even if they leave, they will always give birth to girls. I wasn't too sure of what to make of the setting just yet, though much of that would be recontextualized once we got to know Hancock, so more on that in a bit. Oh, and just before we move on, I literally just have a line in my notes saying, "Sheesh, thank the heavens that Sanji didn't end up here." Anyway, Luffy has fashioned a new outfit, which was brilliant, but more importantly we meet Margaret, who unlike the rest of her tribe is much more tolerant toward Luffy and offers to hear him out. Straight away, Margaret was an awesome character and I really hope she shows up sometime again. Her dynamic with Luffy was absolutely awesome. Though she also drops a whole bunch more lore on us. Primarily that the island is in the calm belt, and that the only ships that can get through is Hancock's and the Marines. Though with Luffy being Luffy, he is still certain that he'll manage, and even says that he'll walk on his hands to Sabaody to toughen up. This made me laugh more than I'd like to admit. But despite her initially chill vibe, Margaret begins to shoot Luffy, which is when we learn that their arrows are imbued with Haki. And am I reading into this too much, or does this actually have huge implications? We've obviously already had some hints of Haki with Shanks and Luffy and Sabaody as well as Rayleigh, but does this reveal that it can also be imbued into weapons? Because if it does, then when are we going to see a weapon with a devil fruit power that is cursed and is also channeling Haki? Jokes aside, this whole Haki thing has me very intrigued, and I still can't quite pin down exactly what it does. Especially with Mantra still being in the picture as well. Though more on this when we get to Luffy's Conqueror's Haki. We then cut to Hancock, who's meeting with the Vice Admiral, and it's here where we are updated on what's going on with Ace. His execution will be held 1 week from now in Marineford, and Whitebeard has already started to move. This did make me rethink about how this might potentially go down. Since he is supposedly going to be moved, and we've been given a new location, my current theory is that they may try to hit the convoy in transit. If heist movies have taught me anything, that is by far the easiest route, as they could set up an entire ambush themselves. Though with that said, if we jump forward a bit, we'd obviously see Luffy heading straight for Impel Down, further making me question as to how this thing will play out. With how much it's being played up as a potentially world-changing event, and with us hearing of the new world, I am still holding out for that 2% possibility that Ace will not survive this. And because my thoughts on this particular point of the story have changed so much, why don't we just introduce a Ace's death rate counter? I won't mention it every time, but since my notes were literally filled with my thoughts changing after several events, I'll just update it whenever those happen, so keep an eye out. As for Hancock herself, my notes simply said, her, she just kicked a kitten. Yeah, for real, she might actually be super chill, has a tragic past and all that, but I still won't forgive her for kicking the cat. That's just not cool. Though yeah, I love how she was just played up as this comically evil character who destroys children's statues, throws people out of the window, etc, etc. It just made the juxtaposition of her falling in love with Luffy that much more silly. Speaking of which, let's get into Luffy's initial meeting with her. Obviously, his line of thinking is, as usual, impeccable. He'll get lost without Nami, so he'll ask for a ride. If he wants a ride, he needs an important person. Important people live in tall buildings. So he heads straight for the tallest building, and while his very serious problem-solving skills did give me a good laugh, it actually worked and he does end up in her palace. Though, he does overshoot a little and lands straight in her bathroom where she's bathing. And this sequence here captured Luffy's character so perfectly. Obviously, the whole premise for Hancock's ability is that the person must be attracted to her for it to work. But because Luffy is just the purest thing ever created, it literally has zero effect on him. And in a broader sense, I think it's moments like these where we see him have that, for lack of a better word, childish view of the world, make those times where he is suddenly stone cold serious so much more impactful. For example, would Luffy calling off his crew back in Sabaody be so surprising if it wasn't for his usual super innocent vibe? I honestly don't think so. So yeah, this was a great scene all around. Though in the story context, this is where we figure out that the whole eyes on the back thing is more than a little sus. At this point, I'll be honest, I still had no clue what it may be, especially with Luffy saying that it looks familiar somehow. Obviously, we would find out very soon that it was the marking of the Celestial Dragons, which we'll talk about at length in just a little bit. But as of now, I was throwing around many ideas, including the symbol we saw on Law and on the auction house and with Doflamingo, among many other things that clearly turned out to be wrong. Though, that's beside the point. In short, Luffy tries running again, but is ultimately captured and is said to be executed. And, once again, we get yet another sequence of the most pure events you can imagine. Margaret speaks up saying that Luffy has been honest and that they should at least hear him out, though Hancock petrifies them for supposedly working with the enemy. And then, once again being the purest creature ever, instead of worrying about himself, Luffy calls a timeout and proceeds to move the petrified trio. Just how quickly he's like, "Oh, they saved me, that means they're my friends now," was just the perfect example of who Luffy is. And yes, I got a good laugh out of it as well. And in a broader sense, as I talked about at the start of the video, seeing Luffy alone was certainly strange for this arc, but I feel like him being in the spotlight this entire time did seriously make me like seeing him a lot more than I thought I would. Don't get me wrong, if I were to rank my favorite members, Luffy has always been up there, but this arc where we see him seriously shine just made that so much more pronounced, especially after the events of Sabaody. As for the fight itself, honestly, I didn't really care much for it, so we'll only be looking at the few notable events. And first and foremost, the Conqueror's Haki. We are told that this is an incredibly rare form of Haki, and that only 1 in 1 million is capable of using it. Which, if my thought process is correct, just elevates Shanks and Rayleigh's power even further, as they are the only ones we've seen with such a power. Though this brings me onto the question of, is this something you're born with, or is Luffy in some way special? And on top of that, does Zoro, who seemingly used Haki in Sabaody, also possess the Conqueror's Haki? Hello, Editing Korotos here. At the time of recording, Sabaody still hadn't gone out, so I talk about it a bit more here. Apparently it's an added scene for the anime, so I'm guessing I just read into it a little too much, and it was indeed just him being intimidating and nothing else. So yeah, just ignore everything I say about Zoro's Haki, but the rest still stands. If it is conviction or will or something along those lines, then Luffy surely has to be up there in terms of power. Though, as I've said before, that would also imply that those with D in their name also possess incredibly strong Haki, as their will is incredibly strong. Which leads me on to my final question of, if it is possible to channel weapons with Haki, and it is possible to feed a devil fruit to a weapon, what sort of insane combinations can you come up with? I brought it up briefly as a joke, but isn't that basically an immortal being that you can control? Imagine someone like Blackbeard getting his hands on a couple of weapons with fruit powers and imbuing them with Haki. He'd be unstoppable. And, because I am a big weirdo, I obviously looked through every single scene he's appeared in so far, to see if there are any hints of this, and I'll be honest, his rings are super sus. So might they just have some sort of cursed properties like Zoro's sword? Back when we saw him in Jaya, he didn't have any of them. Yet now, both of his hands are covered with them. Sure, he may just be repping that drip, but I don't know, at this point I'm suspicious of anything he does. Oh, and his missing teeth switch place, so at least we know he's been to a dentist. Anyway, another thing that we see here is that they seemingly use 2 different kinds of Haki. One that allows them to dodge Luffy's attacks, and the other that allows them to damage Luffy despite his fruit ability. The dodging part we've already seen in Skypiea, so I guess that pretty much sets in stone that those are essentially the same, though I still have questions about how one might acquire it, or train it, or unlock it, or whatever. But the bypassing of a fruit power is the more serious one. Back when we saw Blackbeard exhibit this sort of power, that was down to his fruits. But it appears that we are finally getting a concrete counter to Logia fruits. If you recall what I said about the Light Admiral back in Sabaody, if he really is capable of moving at the speed of light, he is basically invulnerable, as even if you got close to him with a Sea Prism Stone, he'd just zip out of there. Well, if Haki is able to completely bypass it, then that's a different story. I still don't quite get how it works, but I think we already saw some of this sort of Haki in action once Rayleigh blocked his kick in Sabaody. Either way, I am really curious to see this whole thing develop. As Luffy nears victory though, we are once again shown that he is indeed just the coolest guy around, as despite defeating someone who literally just tried to kill him, he jumps on Boa's back to cover the marking. And as if that wasn't enough, we see Hancock give him a choice. Either leave by ship, which again, is the thing he wants to do, or have Margaret and the two others reverted back to normal. And without ever skipping a beat, he bows and says, "Wow, thank you, revert them." Again, how can you not love this guy? I don't think I could keep up his level of wholesomeness for 10 minutes on a good day, let alone minutes after finishing a fight for my life. So yes, this genuine moment of humility that Luffy shows is definitely worthy of these chef's keys. And now that Hancock too is starting to respect Luffy, we finally get to hear her backstory, and oh boy, is it dark. This is pretty much the type of story I expected we see in Sabaody, but I think the way it was handled here was nearly perfect. In a way, we are never really told of the horror she lived through, and it's only implied what happened there. If you happen to watch my Walking Dead videos, it feels like I've been talking about this a lot lately, but I'm a huge fan of this sort of implied horror. I find that it's much more common in book form, but I think there are definitely ways to make it work just as well in animated or live action form. And this is one of those things that I really enjoy looking at when adaptations happen. For example, The Walking Dead mostly removed these sorts of ambiguous and implied retellings of stories, and just opted for full-on flashbacks. Whereas in One Piece, we've gotten a good mix of that. There are definitely plenty of flashbacks, but we also see this approach used here and there. Zoro's nothing happened moment was also quite similar. We saw the aftermath, but we don't really know what happened there. And so it leaves you with some very messed up questions of how long did he suffer there? Was he screaming the entire time, etc, etc. And that's the wonderful thing about this approach. Human beings are pretty messed up. So when you tell us that something bad happened but don't fully explain it, there is a very good chance that your imagination will make it even worse. Anyway, I'll stop nerding out over technicalities of storytelling. She then talks about the marking itself. Firstly, talking about how she has lived in constant fear of anyone seeing her back, which was indeed very heartbreaking, and definitely humanized her seemingly overzealous protectionism quite a bit. Though the detail here that I really enjoyed was when we hear of how the marking has changed since then. After Fisher Tiger, who I am 300% certain we'll be hearing from sometime soon, I mean, he climbed up the red line, he's an absolute chad. But yeah, when he saved everyone, they put another marking on top of the Celestial Dragon one, and became the Sun Pirates. Or in more real-world terms, they took away the power of the marking and made it their own. The commentary here should be fairly obvious. Though what I think was the best detail about this entire thing is that all members of the crew have to get the marking, so you can never tell who's been a slave and who hasn't. Yes, it's a small detail, but I think it is a very nice contrast to show that even among pirates who you'd consider to be criminals, they have far more honor and even humanity than any of these nobles. So yes, the way these sorts of very dark themes were handled was great in my opinion. And in story, here too Luffy is just the best dude ever, as when she says that he's probably disgusted by her now, Luffy's like, why would I care if you're a slave? I hate the celestial dragons. Yeah, Luffy in this arc is a big W. But with that, she agrees to give him a ride, and so they team up. Though before they set out, we see Luffy showing everyone how to party, and I won't lie, this had me laughing out loud the whole way through. Him singing yo ho ho ho, and then being genuinely angry that no one else is joining, was just brilliant. Though following this, we see him just chilling with Margaret and ending up in the granny's house. And, as is trend with One Piece, when I thought things were finally calming down, the big bombshells begin to drop. It's here where Luffy finds out everything going on surrounding Ace's execution. That it was Blackbeard who defeated him, that it will happen in Marineford, and everything else in regards to the war. And the shot of Luffy learning of Ace's execution was exactly what I expected from him. As I said all the way back then, I knew he was never going to brush this off. And so we see him yell out asking, what does she mean his brother is going to be executed? And then him learning that it's literally almost impossible for him to make it in time was just the cherry on top. As I said in Thriller Bark, the whole Vivre card thing seriously seemed like the final catalyst in this war. So despite Sabaody throwing a wrench in the works, things do appear to be going somewhat close to what I expected. That is, of course, apart from literally the rest of the crew. In fact, here we see Luffy apologizing to them and saying that Ace takes priority on this one, making me question when exactly are we going to see the crew again. With us headed to Impel Down and with what we'd see in the separation specials, I don't see any way of them reuniting anytime soon. So at this point, the big question is, how long is Luffy going solo? Though with that said, I need to see this war like literally right now. It might not be exactly what I'd been talking about, but it still sounds very big. Obviously with the scope of it, I expect there to be a ton of fighting, but I also definitely expect some very big reveals, since this is going to function as our first look at the much larger world. And yeah, when compared to someone like Whitebeard, Luffy is still very much small time. Though with time running out, Luffy heads straight over to Hancock where we find out that she is sick, exactly like many other Empresses before her. And there I was sitting like, wait what? What is Luffy going to do now? That was of course until we find out that she was lovesick. So yeah, that gave me a good chuckle. And with that said, they prepare to head off as everyone waves them off. Though since they clearly have to be undetected, Hancock uses her warlord title to essentially bluff them into not searching her, and sneaking Luffy in as well. And the way they did it was like, are you serious? Is this really going to work? But I mean, it did work, so I guess there's that. And with that, the final pieces in this grand war have begun to move. And to signal that, we cut to Sengoku, who talks about the 6 out of the 7 warlords being in attendance, the only one missing being Jinbei. Though we then hear that contact with all of the 23 of the Navy's ships has been lost. And on top of that, they report very worrying movements among other pirates in the New World. Basically, war is here. Please, let's get to it like right now. Though the very final scene that we see here was Garp going to meet Ace. And oh boy, at this point, I'll be honest, I am beginning to believe more and more that Ace will die. Mostly because of scenes like this. The emotion is played up so much that if this seriously leads to nothing, then like, honestly this war might just be ruined. I admit I may once again be in denial, but I think this is a very crucial turning point in One Piece's story, and not going through with that would seriously damage the integrity of the story. I mean, don't get me wrong, based on what we've seen with Ace, I really want to see him vibe with Luffy a bit more, but at the same time, I do think that he has to die here. I really hope I'm not going to be writing another 5-page rant about immortal characters, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see how this plays out in Impel Down. And finally, since I've blazed through this arc very fast, mostly because I really want to watch Impel Down, but I had to write this script to remain clueless about what's to come, so cut me some slack please. We've still got the 3 separation episodes to talk about. These are adapted from the cover stories of the manga, so I'm not too sure how much of them are canon and how much is added to have a little more runtime, though we'll talk about them regardless. I won't rank them since there's really barely anything to go off of here, but let's get into it. Nami has ended up on a sky island by the name of Weatheria, and a wizard-looking dude has been looking after her. The most notable thing here are the wind knots she acquires, which leads me onto a broader question. As we'll see in just a bit, the crew is scattered literally all over the place, so I would expect them to get quite a bit stronger until they finally meet back up. So what kind of new powers might we expect? I'm still not exactly sure when that may happen, since some of them are literally all the way back in the East Blue, but I would expect for it to take quite a long time since that's basically the ride we've been on right now. And on a similar note, will they not take part in this war? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I honestly have no idea. Next up, we see Franky, who's landed on a winter island. Just 2 things to mention here. Him not having cola and instantly becoming a butler as he drinks some tea was the most brilliant execution of this gag yet, so big props there. Though what's clearly much more important is that this is the home of Dr. Vegapunk. And oh boy, I'd love to get into some speculation here, though again, I'm not sure how much of this is canon, so I don't really know how much of it is actually applicable. Though with that said, just what kind of upgrades might Franky get if he were to stumble into Vegapunk's lab? Might we see a completely different Franky once they meet back up with even more weapons and gadgets? Again, since he does appear to be a long ways off, I'm guessing we won't be seeing him anytime soon, so who knows. Next up, we have Chopper's story, which was honestly just super sad. We see that he's landed on an island in the South Blue, an island where birds reign supreme, so he's basically bullied a bunch and that's it. Though the worst part was the scene where he's trying to have fun, but then just says, maybe I'll never see them again. Considering he only left Drum Island because of the crew, this must be so rough for him. So yeah, that was very sad. But since this island is dominated by animals, I'd expect for him to also get quite a bit better at his doctoral duties as he inevitably ends up helping the animals here. Moving on, we have Sanji's story, which, while still somewhat comedic, did feel super one-note for me. And out of the ones we've seen so far, was definitely my least favorite. He ends up on what seems to be another island of women, but it turns out to be not quite what he expected, and he's basically chased around a bunch. I don't really know how we're going to see him developed based on what we see here, so I don't really even have anything else to add, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Next up, we have Robin's story, and oh boy, was this one rough. Firstly, we find out that she's landed in a country that is basically just one giant bridge. In terms of world building, I absolutely love this sort of setting. It's such a unique concept that I would actually love to see more of it. That is, if it wasn't for what we found out in the story. As someone from Eastern Europe, this hit a little close to home, as it basically looked like a history lesson. So yeah, in that sense, I never want to return there again. Oh, and on this note, why do so many of you think I'm American? I've been dissing the Imperial system this entire series. I thought that would be a pretty good indicator. But anyway, that's not important right now. I think this sort of story hurt a lot more because it was Robin. So many times already we've seen her freedom being ripped away. Firstly with Crocky, where she arguably didn't have any free will, then in Eni's lobby, and now after all of those trials, at the end of Sabaody, she's once again taken to this sort of place. So yeah, in terms of these mini-stories, despite this one being super dark and almost uncomfortable for the aforementioned relevance, I think this one was my favorite. Moving on, we have Usopp, who's landed in a jungle. Honestly, I have literally no clue what to make of his mini-story. He ends up meeting this dude who seems to be pretty tough, so will he become an apprentice of sorts? I genuinely have no clue what we may see here, but since it is a very deadly jungle, I guess he may become more crafty? Either way, I'm really curious to see what a leveled up Usopp looks like. Next up, ZORO, who's landed on the same island where GHOSTGIRL has. Right away, as I said in Thriller Bark, I was more than open to the possibility of her returning at some point. So this had me super excited to what kind of shenanigans they may get into. Though unfortunately, similar to Usopp's story, I have literally no clue what to make of it. I mean, Zoro's still pretty messed up from all the times he's been blasted recently, and I'm not too sure how GHOSTGIRL can help him with swordsman abilities. So yeah, I'm not really sure. Though as a duo, I really want to see more of them. You know what? Just let her become a Straw Hat. She is genuinely awesome. Though finally, we have Brook, who's somehow ended up in the middle of a cult. I'll just say it. I have literally no idea what's going on here and how his story may play out, so I literally have nothing to add here. It's definitely interesting in the sense that it's very, very different, but I have literally no idea what's going on here. So yeah, as of right now, the crew is scattered all over the place, and I really don't know what this means for their immediate stories. As far as I understand, none of them know about Ace, and are only concerned with returning to Sabaody, but that's obviously going to take a while. So, does that mean we're only going to see them in, what, months? I'm really not sure. Though with that said, we cut to Marie Joie, where we see the warlords meeting, we see the Marines gathering in Marineford, including Jonathan, or Joseph, I don't know, Jojo has ruined me, and many others, well and truly signaling the scale of this conflict. Though in the very last scene, we see the continuation of Garp's meeting with Ace, where he just asks Garp to kill him. Only for Garp to respond, "That won't change anything. Whitebeard will attack anyway," as Ace calls for his father. Oh boy, I am at the edge of my seat already. This is seriously looking to be a world-changing event, and I cannot wait to see how it develops. And that's Amazon Lily. All in all, this one was a bit hit and miss for me. Perhaps because it's sandwiched between Sabaody, which was obviously massive, and the much anticipated Impel Down, though it almost felt a little fillery in its nature. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of great moments in this one, but all in all, I did want to get through it as fast as I could just so I could dive into the conflict as soon as possible. And so with that said, this one will be taking the bottom C tier. Again, there's certainly some bias here as I was just legit blazing through it as fast as I could, but yes, those are my honest first impressions of it. And with that, next time we will finally be getting into the assault on Impel Down. And that's the video. I originally thought this one would end up being a little shorter, but hey, once again here we are after more than half an hour. Though as usual, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And speaking of which, let us give a warm welcomes to the newest members of the team, Chimney, Matthew Hammock, and Connor Adams. At this point, the font is getting so small that I'll have to rethink how I handle the credits, but seriously, the support means more than you know. Thank you, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 buckaroo per month. And of course, last but not least, let us do the secret phrase. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words, yellow line. Let's see what you come up with. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.